want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you who have come to participate in this very important event on Taiwan's new approach, opportunities and challenges under President Ma Ying-jeou's administration. And of course, as all of you know, it's always been exciting and interesting to watch the developments on Taiwan. But before I get to the details, and I will be very brief, I just want to say a few words about the Center for East Asian Studies, because there are all sorts of myths and ideas about this kind of centers in North America. This one was founded, has its roots going back to the 1930s. Briefly put, it is a center that supports student activities, research, particularly faculty and graduate student research with regard to Northeast Asia. And we sponsor various workshops, conferences, in particular across campus. In fact, maybe 5 or 6 workshops related to Northeast Asia alone. There is actually a separate committee on South Asian studies on campus. And this particular conference, I noted, obviously, we are much more focused on the social sciences side, and we have several panelists who either have very distinguished scholarly experience or have worked and, like Professor Lin, had been in government previously. So in that sense, I hope this would encourage a sort of dialogue, so sort of that perhaps will reveal some unique insights into how Taiwan functions in the broader sort of environment, particularly in light of the cross-strait relations, which is also been evolving very significantly. My sense is probably beginning next month, passengers would likely be able to travel between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland without actually, or it used to be you have to go through, you have to land and then restart in Hong Kong and Macau. Now you don't have to land, but you have to travel the routes. So you go south and then go north. But it looks likely that they would be able, there would be the possibility of directly flying all the way from Taiwan to the mainland. Who knows? Maybe down the road there's conferences like this can be co-sponsored by the two sides as well. Now, let me turn to a brief introduction of our distinguished speaker who opens the conference, the Director General, Mr. Thomas Zheng. Mr. Zheng is a diplomat. Really, he studied at National Zhengzhi University, National Taiwan University, and then the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And then he joined the Foreign Service in 1979. As you know, that's a very interesting time to get started in the diplomatic service. And he served really in many posts, from Thailand to Swaziland, and to Dominica. But he has served in very distinguished posts as Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Boston, in Toronto, Canada, and of course, since 2003, he has been in Chicago. And we have been very, very pleased to have him actually in Chicago. In fact, is really he's very much sort of an old friend to the university in many ways, and I do hope that our friendships will continue to blossom with conferences like this. Director General Zheng.
Thank you, Professor Yang. Good morning. Welcome to today's seminar. Your presence shows the importance of today's topics and your intense interest in it. During the previous administration of Democratic Progressive Party, the Taiwan Strait was often perceived as a flashpoint, due mainly to the PRC's opposition to President Chen's persistence undertaking constitutional engineering and insistence on holding referendum on Taiwan membership to the United Nations. And the U.S.-Taiwan relations also suffered a setback during President Chen's second term, as Taiwan U.S. trust of President Chen had sunken to its lowest point. Therefore, the victory of Dr. Ma Ying-jeou of Kuomintang in the 2008 presidential election was seen by many as a significant, encouraging result that provides an opportunity for reconciliation and dialogue between the two sides. President Ma advocates improvement of relations between Taiwan and China, and with ultimate goal of peace and co-prosperity of the Taiwan Strait. He envisioned Taiwan as a peacemaker, as responsible stakeholder in the community of nations. But how much President Ma's new policies will succeed depends largely on Beijing's response and the reaction and cooperation of the DPP. Today, just over 5 months into the Ma administration, we have invited many leading authorities in Taiwan-China studies to give their observation and even to engage in debates in the hope of providing recommendations or advices to policymakers in the capitals concerned. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists and the presenters for taking time out of your busy schedule to share their insights. I would be remiss if I failed to acknowledge the great efforts of the Center for East Asian Studies, the co-sponsor of the seminar, and particularly Professor Dali Yan and Associate Director Ted Foss, for making this seminar possible. It is a great pleasure to work with you, and special thanks to our Deputy Representative Zhang for making the effort to join us today. And finally, thank you all for participation. I hope you enjoyed today's seminar. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll turn over to Professor De Wang, who is chairing the next panel, and I'll leave all the details to you to manage this wonderful group of panelists, including Professor Lin and my dear colleague, John Mearsheimer, and I'm sure it'll be very interesting.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to chair the first panel. And we have 2 hours, that is 120 minutes, which is quite unusual for a panel, this academic panel. So we have plenty of time, and therefore prior to the panel starts, I did ask my colleagues how much time they need. We have 2 papers, excellent papers to be presented here, and also we have 2 distinguished colleagues who will make comments. In general, because we have plenty of time, I'm not going to strictly enforce the timing here. And first of all, I would like to introduce our panelists. Sitting on my right-hand side is Professor Lin Zhongbin. Professor Lin is Danjiang University. He's from Taiwan, and he was the Vice Minister of the Mainland Affairs Committee. Currently is a professor at Danjiang University. And the second paper will be presented by Shirley Rigger, sitting over there. So you want to sit there for the moment? Okay. I can see that. Sure. Shirley is a professor at Davidson College, good old friend of mine, and also an expert on Taiwan and cross-strait relations. And then we have 2 discussants, Dr. John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago. Dr. Mearsheimer is very famous, especially is has a very, very tight schedule, speech engagement. So it's a great honor to sit on the same panel with him. Then the second discussant is Professor T.J. Chen, who's also sitting over there. He's from the College of William and Mary. He's also the editor of the journal, help me on the Journal of Democracy. Yeah, Taiwan Journal of Democracy. Thank you. Okay, as I said, I'm not going to strictly enforce the time because we have plenty of time. So I'm going to ask Professor Lin to present his paper.
Thank you. Should I do it from here or
Yeah, you can do it here. Either way, it's up to you.
no, stand up to show my
Are you going to
respect?
use slides?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'll sit in the audience then.
This on? Okay. Late 2007, Taipei-Washington relations deteriorated to a record low. The then Taiwan President Chen Shui-bian insisted on holding a referendum. With the coming presidential election in March 2008, on joining the United Nations for Taiwan under the name of Taiwan, rather than returning to it under the name of Republic China, which, of course, to many sounded like inching in towards independence, and many were afraid of dire consequences in terms of Beijing's strong reactions. Washington repeatedly warned against this. Therefore, the feelings in Taiwan was that Washington interfered in our domestic affairs. Anti-Americanism was on the rise. Amidst the sentiments and weakening of Taiwan's economy, somebody came up with a brilliant idea, empirically based on history of success stories of Japan and Germany. Both fought with the United States, lost, and prospered. We should declare war on the United States. So it went. But the idea was quickly dropped because nobody could answer the question, what if we won? To show my respect to this astute audience, let me begin with the end. Let me begin with my conclusions. First, a picture. On the 14th of October, in a remote corner of the world, an incident took place. Russia returned this land, this island, to China, which completed the settlement of the more than 4,000 kilometers long disputed borders. However, this small incident carried with it implication of global and historical magnitude. Having set in motion Cross-Strait and Sino-Japan détente, Beijing now faces a world without any country whose government is not improving relations with or having stable relations with China, which is a phenomenon unique among great powers today. Count United States, Russia, England, Japan. And perhaps unprecedented, historically speaking, in Chinese past. Even during the Tang and Han dynasties, there were enemies, there were wars. The second conclusion is that Beijing's Taiwan policy has evolved from sweeter carrot and harder stick, which was from my coinage in February 2005, toward more carrot than stick, coined again in September 2007. Now the carrot is more manifest, while the stick remains, but is less visible. By the way, there are op-eds and some handouts which will substantiate what I'm saying here. The third, that prospects of the current cross-strait détente depends, like Director Chen said, more on Beijing's flexibility than on Taipei's unilateral goodwill, which has already been plenty. The former is determined, again, empirically based on, in descending order, by China's domestic conditions, Beijing-Washington relations, and Taipei's words and deeds. The fourth is that Beijing's sophisticated foreign policy, which includes Taiwan policy, has continued to outstrip prevailing perception since late 2002, mainly due to insufficient grasping of Beijing's grand strategy which underlies its foreign policy. Beijing's grand strategy, simply put, is characterized by, first of all, confident patience. Secondly, extra military emphasis. Extra military is defined as transcending but not excluding the military. And integration of policy instruments, indirection when opposing another state. The other one is that China's growing international influence has brought about among U.S. opinion leaders a budding idea of accommodation. It has crept from media opinions into the official language. Not a theory, and neither yet a policy. It has the potential, however, I would say, of becoming a competing option in addition to the existent engagement, containment, and hedging, which to me is co-engagement incarnated. The next is that in the scenarios of engagement, containment, or even hedging, Washington plays the lead. In the scenarios of in the scenario of accommodation, however, Washington holds no longer the title role. In engagement, Washington held the bulk of initiatives, but accommodation it no longer does. However, the United States eventually decides to face the rising China. Taiwan, I would say, can play a crucial role in the U.S. national interest. To engage the rising China, Taiwan is the beacon for China's democracy. To contain or hedge against it, Taiwan guards the most vital portal of the first island chain. And to accommodate to it, Taiwan stands as a buffer. The last one, however the U.S. eventually decides to face the rising China, let me go to the cross-strait détente. I will fly over this because my distinguished colleague, Professor Chen, will fill in the details with even better presentation. I had been sharing my views, but my view did not register. As early as 2006, I said Beijing changed its tactics already in a piece in International Herald Tribune entitled Beijing Speaks Softly to Taiwan. Later on in June that year, I wrote a piece entitled If Ma Ying-jeou and Hu Jintao consolidate power respectively, will there be détente? My answer is yes, and there are 7 implications. And the fourth is a decline of the military tension. The first was establishment of liaison offices. The second is the, of course, chartered flights, as has already been mentioned. The third is that Taipei will switch from nominal diplomacy to substantive diplomacy. The fifth is that DPP may have to readjust itself, and on and on. These did not register. So before the 17th Party Congress in October last year, this quite well-known journalist Joseph Kahn, who had been accurate before, said Hu Jintao was weak and Chen Shih-bian was pushing for referendum. Therefore, when Hu Jintao gave the speech, he will mention very strongly about the referendum in order to garner support within his party and may even resort to use of force. I'm sorry to say he was wrong. An expert within the KMT, his name is deleted to avoid embarrassment, said the same thing. Hu Jintao will mention the referendum with strong words. Both were wrong. When Hu Jintao gave the speech, he mentioned nothing of the referendum. Instead, he offered an olive branch of peace treaty. And in addition, he deleted what Jiang Zemin said 5 years ago. A strong line that we staunchly oppose any words or deeds fabricating Taiwan independence, 2 Chinas, 1 China and 1 Taiwan. And this, I sent to Paris this piece, which was printed right away on the same day. My thesis was that Hu Jintao was underestimated. Anyway, the prevailing perception continues. The then Vice President Anna Liu said, we do not rule out the possibility that Beijing may act irrationally, meaning war. She was wrong. and famous professor from Tsinghua University, who has been called by Mark Leonard as the Yukon of China, issued to apologize because he had been saying that by the end of 2008, there will be a war across Taiwan Strait. He apologized. That means he's very important, and he's still going to be very famous. Anyway, when Ma Ying-jeou was elected, and before and after, he did three things which were perceived to be something antagonistic to Beijing. First of all, he appointed a pro-independence Dr. Lai Xingyuan as the head of Main Affairs Council. Second, Ma Ying-jeou said within his lifetime he will not see unification. Third, after the March 14th riot in Lhasa, after the PAP and PLA suppressed the rioters, Ma Ying-jeou said if he is inaugurated as president, he does not rule out boycotting the Olympics. So people in Taiwan were saying perhaps Beijing will punish Ma by doing one of the three of all of three things. First, canceling the prearranged trip of the KMT chairman Wu Boxiu to Beijing. Second, canceling the again prearranged trip of the vice president-elect Vincent Hsu to Bo'ao meeting with Hu Jintao. Third, by postponing or scrap altogether the promised July 4th charter flights. All three, none of them happened. And moreover, Beijing will go forward on engagement with Taiwan. Let's look very briefly what Beijing is doing differently after the election of Ma. First of all, charter flights. Secondly, recognition diplomatic warfare on hold. At least Paraguay and Panama, who have been asking Beijing to recognize them, Beijing said no. And governmental contacts and flexibility on many controversial issues. This is a chart showing that Beijing had been very active in taking the friends of China. But the last one occurred in January this year. It has already been almost 10 months. Taiwan, on its part, has been doing a lot as well. This is what Chen Shui-bian did, and this is what Ma Ying-jeou is doing, accepting a one cultural China and not ruling out a future one political China. Secondly, defensive strategic posturing, halting the long-range counter-value cruise missile development. Third, stopping domestic designification campaigns. And fourth, calling for a cross-strait diplomatic truce. Well, let's go back. I wrote a piece February 1st, 2005, coining the phrase in Chinese, the hard becomes harder, the soft becomes softer. Later on, in English, becomes sweeter carrot and harder stick. Then I had a 1 hour-long debate over a long-distance call with the editor in Washington last September, deciding on the topic of my paper. He did not quite agree with me. I said, don't worry, there won't be a war. But he said, we like provocative views, so he allowed me to go ahead. Well, these papers are also available if you're interested on front. My view is that the prevailing views continue to underestimate Beijing's sophisticated softening of its foreign policy because these views are based on a rear-view mirror imaging of the 1995-1996 cross-strait tension, which I had predicted. Among several pieces, I will show you one. This was published in summer of 1994, and in conclusion, I said Washington should unambiguously reiterate U.S. interest in and commitment to the regional peace and prepare for the seemingly unlikely scenario of a sudden security crisis caused by a more modernized PLA, flexing and even using its newly gained military muscles. During those days, I was considered a gadfly in Washington, an alarmist. Chongping is wasting our conference time again. But after 95, 96, suddenly prevailing views went to the other extreme. Well, let's go back. When Hu Jintao was taking over from Jiang Zemin, it took 3 years. September 04, or rather November 02 up until March '05. Hu Jintao partly inherited from the learning of previous people in charge of policy, partly because of his own inclination, did four things differently. First of all, he dropped the timetable completely. Dropping doesn't mean not thinking, though. Secondly, he put emphasis on economic, social, cultural, you will name it, instruments, and de-emphasizing the military. The annual large-scale military exercises held on Dongshan Island stopped completely since 2005. Third, reach in Taiwan. As he said to the people responsible for propaganda in Taiwan, December '04, he said, enter the island, enter the household, and enter the mind. Fourth, of course, the two-pronged approach, carrot and stick. Fifth, constraining Taipei through Washington and other places like Singapore, even Canberra and Brussels, one time Paris and Berlin. Let's review anti-succession law. When it first came out on the 14th of March 2005, people thought it was a legal preparation for attacking Taiwan militarily. My piece appeared the next day. I said no. I said, after passing the anti-succession law, Beijing will proactively launch soft offensives on Taiwan, such as allowing Taiwan compatriots to take professional exams and to acquire working licenses, to allow Taiwan students to study in Foreign Affairs University, which is established to train professional diplomats for Beijing. Well, this year, in February, the Dean of China's Foreign Affairs University indicated the school will allow Taiwan students. In the same month, China's Ministry of Health announced that practicing medical doctors in Taiwan may now work on the mainland without having passed the license exams, as long as they have worked 3 years in Taiwan. And I've been watching these soft offensives starting in May 2005 with pandas, ending in February this year. 44 of them. Well, I think part of the problem is that people were too busy to read the words of the anti-succession law. When you read a word, you will see Article 1 to 5 are empty talk, nothing new, no beef. The beef starts in Article 6 on cross-strait negotiations, or rather cross-strait interactions, exchanges. Article 7, cross-strait negotiations. The number of words add up much more than the hard prongs. Article 8 is the controversial one on non-peaceful means. Article 9 is on the remedy of non-peaceful means. You can see the weight already just by counting the words. So there are some interesting things in these words. The second is that the non-peaceful means allows China's civilian leaders more elbow room than the use of force. Up until 2004, China kept saying, we do not rule out the use of force against Taiwan. However, in the white paper of defense in 2004, that line was dropped. The use of force was 100, peace is 0. The non-peaceful means goes from 100 to 10. The 3 hurdles now required to implement the non-peaceful means. Before, when Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping said we will launch a war against Vietnam, India, everybody raised their hands in the Central Military Commission, go. Now, not that simple. The first hurdle is the State Council consisting of all civilians. Then another interesting thing is that the last article, Article 9, remedy of the non-peaceful means, said Beijing will guarantee the life and prosperity and other rights of Taiwanese civilians and foreign residents, meaning that the missiles or whatever weapon, high-tech weapons are used will hit only the independence advocates. I have been a student of military affairs for decades. To this day, I know of none such high-tech weapons. Forgive my ignorance. Well, Beijing has learned very fast. In 1995, 1996, Beijing launched a verbal attacks and military intimidation. 4 years later, Beijing dropped the military intimidation. Verbal attacks culminated on 15th of March 2000 when the then Prime Minister Zhu Rongji waved his fist on TV, warning Taiwanese voters not to vote DPP or else. It actually catapulted the struggling candidate at that time named Chen Shui-bian into presidency with only 2.54% of margin. Still 4 years later, Beijing became even smarter. None of the above. In November 2003, several months after Chen Shui-bian was pushing for referendum, Beijing only distributed a communique to the more than 170 embassies in Beijing, stating Beijing's position on Taiwan issue with prudently chosen words and very stern posture, but no flamboyant words like pulverizing Li Denghui. This was the first time since 1949 Beijing internationalized issue of Taiwan, which Beijing had before considered as domestic affairs, none of their business. Still 4 years later, Beijing goes to Washington and other capitals. So we see from late June until early February, high-ranking officials from State Department warned Taipei 12 times. Unprecedented. Did it work? I think so. The public opinions conducted by academic and commercial institutions commissioned by the Ministry Affairs Council, which began in 1992 with the same wording, quite credible, show that from August to December, the pro-status quo jumped into percentage from 52 to 65, pro-independence dropped from 26 to 19. Of course, the failure of the DPP in election was also due to sagging economy and corruption, but this cannot be denied, was one of the factors. Therefore, this is the new situation. It's getting more complicated. Well, let's look at the current situation. Things started to change since December. You see, pro-status quo started to drop. Pro-independence started to climb. Therefore, there's an uncertainty in the future of the continuation or development of cross-strait détente. What do we do? Well, first of all, let's step back a little bit. In the decade of 90s, two happy things happened, two unhappy things happened. The happy things were the meeting of Wang Daohan and Gu Zhenfu in April 93. Another one was the meeting of two of them in October 98. The unhappy things were crises in 99 and 1996. They all had to do with domestic conditions. Secondly, Beijing-Washington relations. Only thirdly, Taipei's words and deeds. Therefore, I would say, looking to the future, the positive factors, first of all, is the strengthened status of Hu Jintao after Olympics, China's wealth accumulation, and its not liberalized financial system as a buffer against global financial crisis. Washington relations, Beijing-Washington relations, very stable. More than 60 dialogues, official dialogues, going on every year. Ma Ying-jeou's pro-engagement in a policy. However, on the negative side, you also have the domestic time bomb in China, the attack on Wen Jiabao lately, and Taiwan's growing domestic discontent on Ma Ying-jeou, and Taiwan's international space restriction, which Beijing has not let loose yet. Let's take a look at Sino-Japan détente. When Hu Jintao went to Tokyo this year, the newspaper title said, "The atmosphere was good, nothing is resolved." That was on 8th of May. International Herald Tribune said, "Progress on pandas, but little else." They were all wrong. On the 9th of May, People's Liberation Army Daily printed 70 agreements in concrete terms between Beijing and Tokyo. They're all very concrete, including exchange of military cadets, including the two capitals, were cooperated on propaganda domestically about the image of the other country, on and on and on. I won't waste your time. And you may say these are empty words. Nothing will come of it. Again, that's wrong too. The difficult negotiations on East China Sea came to fruition soon after. And Japan sent military ships for the first time in decades since the end of World War II to China. Well, go back to the 5th of June 2006. I wrote a piece already. I said if Abe becomes the prime minister, he may adjust the posture on the Yasukuni Shrine visit and improve relations with China for Japan's long-term national interest. It was a heresy at the time. People were thinking of a war between Japan and China. And I thought I better register in English publications. A month later, the 5th of July, my piece was printed in Straits Times. However, the editor had no confidence in my view and labeled my view an optimist view. Well, still, again, the name is deleted to avoid embarrassment. This is a leading expert on China, high-ranking official in Taiwan. Even in August, he said Abe would visit a shrine. He was wrong. Abe did not visit a shrine when he was prime minister. And even when Abe became prime minister, Sunday Herald in London said Japan's newly elected prime minister will lead Japan toward war with his foreign policy. Wrong again. On the 8th of October, Abe went to Beijing before he went to Washington and met with Hu Jintao. People say, oh, it's going to be a short-lived honeymoon. Won't last. They were wrong. Let's take a look at Beijing's grand strategy. It all started in the summer of 2002. I think Beijing reached an important decision on new approach. Anyway, I won't waste your time. Let me fly to the end. In October 2004, it was opinion from the media. Fareed Zakaria said, and to continue thriving in the United States, will have to adjust to the rise of Asia led by China. My former professor, Harry Kissinger, followed suit without using the word adjust, accommodate, adapt, the same meaning. Then next year, it entered cramped into official language. Christopher Hill, testifying on the Hill in May, said one of the key challenges before us, and especially before the nations of Asia Pacific, I thought the United States included, is how to adapt to China's emergence as a regional and global power. And of course, the famous phrase came out, responsible stakeholder, which I think is along the same line of thinking. And even this conservative, James Pinkerton, I'm sure many of you know him, said America needs a new strategy for dealing with China, a country we can't contain and can't afford to fight. Usually conservatives would be inclined towards China threat theory. And lastly, I was so astonished to see Professor Edward A. Wilson, who used to advocate US intervention, has been opposing intervention in recent years. This book, The Grand Exit Strategy, was published in 2002. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Professor Lin's presentation. He has many slides to come, and later on maybe we can ask him to show us the other slides. Now I'm going to ask Shirley to present, and Shirley's topic is domestic politics of Taiwan foreign policy. Please.
Well, talk about your impossible act to follow, right? I have not a single slide. So maybe I could just, put up some of the ones that you didn't use. I really look forward to seeing the rest of them in your paper. That's a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is actually my first visit ever to the University of Chicago. So I am very grateful to have the opportunity to see your beautiful campus and to speak with you on the topic of Taiwan, the domestic politics of Taiwan's foreign relations, a topic which nearly burned itself out before I even got started. As I was preparing for this event, I went to look for some public opinion polling on international relations and foreign policy questions in the Taiwan media. And I went to one of my favorite sources just because it's very easy to use, the unfortunately named Taiwanese television station TVBS, to their public opinion section, and discovered to my alarm that there were no polls on foreign policy issues conducted by TVBS at all. And as I was reflecting on that, it struck me that this is actually quite appropriate. It reflects a truth about Taiwan's domestic politics, which is that Taiwanese don't spend a lot of time thinking about foreign policy. They spend a lot of time thinking about politics and thinking about certain political issues, but foreign policy in the sense of international relations, relations with Africa, Europe, North America, South America, etc., these are just not very prominent in Taiwan, and for a couple of reasons. The first reason, of course, is that Taiwanese are heavily focused on domestic politics and on cross-strait relations. And I do not include cross-strait relations in foreign relations and foreign policy for Taiwan because it occupies a distinct position, whatever one may think about the sort of principles underlying that assertion. I think we have to differentiate between discussions about cross-strait relations and discussions about international relations generally. So there's intense focus on cross-strait relations, and this is understandable because cross-strait relations, as Professor Lin has just so well explained for us, is the primary constraining factor on Taiwan's foreign relations. So foreign relations is inevitably kind of secondary to or following upon factors in cross-strait relations. So cross-strait relations gets the bulk of the attention. And then a second reason I think there's not a lot of discussion in the popular media, at least in Taiwan, about international relations and foreign policy is that there is actually a great deal of consensus in Taiwan on what the goals of Taiwan's foreign policy ought to be. And there is also, I think, a pretty widespread understanding that Taiwan has very little room for maneuver, and that therefore discussions about foreign policy have kind of limited utility because there's just not a huge range of options. So let me begin here with this consensus about goals. Taiwan's foreign policy goals reflect a consensus on the basic nature of Taiwan's interest, which is a consensus in favor of Taiwan's de facto independence. There's lots of debate and discussion and conversation, I know, to the idea that Taiwan politics is polarized and that there is great absence of consensus about where Taiwan should go and what Taiwan's ultimate fate should be. And I actually reject that line of argument. I think in Taiwan there is almost universal acknowledgement that whatever the long-term future of Taiwan might ideally be, perhaps closer to China, perhaps farther from China, in the near term, the goal is to maintain the status quo, to maintain Taiwan's de facto independence, self-determination, self-government, and democratic political form. Once upon a time, of course, foreign policy makers in Taiwan hoped that they might be able to deny recognition as China to the People's Republic of China, but that day is long gone. So what we're really looking at now is we're looking at a society that wants to maintain the status quo, wants to avoid having its domestic autonomy limited any further by the PRC. And the debate then over foreign policy takes place within that general consensus. How foreign policy then achieves that goal centers around a number of things. First of all, I think one of the most important priorities in Taiwan foreign policy is to maintain substantive ties with countries that are critical to Taiwan's security. Obviously, we're talking about the U.S. most importantly, but I think there is also considerable attention and thought given to maintaining good ties with Japan and with the European Union. So the most important thing that Taiwan must do is to ensure that it continues to have access to security assistance from the U.S. and, when possible, from these other actors. And that means that in many situations, Taiwan is constrained to accept compromises and suboptimal relationships. You know, ideally, the relationship between Taipei and Washington would be much more robust and official than it is. But Taiwan's foreign policy makers understand that the substance of the relationship is what matters most, and so are willing to accept the limitations in form. A second aspect of Taiwan's foreign policy that follows from this general consensus on the goal of maintaining de facto independence is to maintain sufficient formal diplomatic relationships to preserve the fig leaf of statehood for Taiwan / the Republic of China. We've had many conversations about how small that list could be, how short the list of formal diplomatic partners for Taiwan could become before it became a kind of lost cause. The idea of Taiwan's formal international statehood position became a lost cause. And I think that those conversations are a bit abstract and sterile, but the bottom line is that it matters. Certainly it matters as an issue in domestic politics that to some limited extent there are nations, sovereign states in the world that recognize the statehood of Taiwan. So that is another objective in Taiwan's foreign policy. And then a third aspect of Taiwan's foreign policy that plays a prominent role is maintaining an economic position for Taiwan that can support both a robust defense and also can raise the cost to China and to the rest of the world of losing Taiwan's economic contribution. So economic prosperity and vitality are important parts of Taiwan's foreign policy because to the extent to which you can make the case that, wow, without Taiwan, the international high-tech economy would collapse, then other countries think about Taiwan's needs and Taiwan's economic contribution when they are making their own foreign policy. And then finally, perhaps the one kind of contradictory element in this list of foreign policy objectives is to avoid affronts to Taiwan's international position and dignity that would erode further its claim to sovereignty. So it is a weak claim to sovereignty. It is an embattled claim to sovereignty. But it is important as a matter of domestic politics and probably also important as a matter of international relations that Taiwan have some vestige of, some remnant of this sovereignty claim. So when the PRC, for example, when PRC media changed the name that they were using to talk about Taiwan's Olympic participation from Zhonghua Taipei to Zhongguo Taipei, Taiwan had to respond to that because this is an affront that chips away at Taiwan's sovereignty claim and needs to be confronted. So in sum, Taiwan's foreign policy, it seems to me, can be sort of summarized as avoiding and resisting international marginalization that would result in a further erosion of its sovereignty and de facto independence. If these are the goals, Taiwan also faces profound constraints on its ability to realize these goals. The combination of Beijing's hostility to many of Taiwan's goals, including, I suspect, the goal of permanent de facto independence. So Beijing's hostility to Taiwan's goals and the ever-growing asymmetry of power between Taiwan and China means that Taiwan's room for maneuver, the space in which it can act, is small and shrinking, which requires Taiwan then to be very nimble, very creative, to avoid losing further ground. And I would point out here, this is such a gloom and doom kind of feeling that I'm getting. You've got the optimist, now you've got the pessimist. But I would point out that Taiwan has been exceptionally successful in avoiding the sort of worst case outcomes that many of us have expected over the years. So nimble and creative Taiwan has been in managing its foreign policy. Taiwan's foreign policy goals are manifested in a number of issues and debates within the domestic political scene. These debates are often very animated. So when we do get media attention to foreign policy in Taiwan, it's around these issues. And in some cases, the debates have been very active, perhaps more animated than the possibility for actually acting on these initiatives justifies. First debate that's very popular in Taiwan, especially during the run-up to presidential elections, is a debate over diplomatic relations. How much resources should Taiwan devote to maintaining formal relations with its diplomatic partners? And on more than one occasion, we've had presidential candidates who said, this money diplomacy isn't worth it. But then they get into office and generally retreat from that view because they discover that no one wants to be the president who lost, 12 out of 24 diplomatic partnerships in his 4 years in office. So Chen Shui-bian did this, Ma Ying-jeou also did this to some extent, sort of questioning the utility and necessity for formal diplomatic ties. You get into office and you realize, yes, I need to do this. Another debate that is often held within the domestic political realm is the debate over how to prioritize substantive unofficial relations and how to beef up or transform unofficial relations into more official relations. And that was something that the Chen Shui-bian administration spent a lot of time trying to do. My perception is that it has generally not been a very successful strategy for Taiwan to try to slide formality into informal relationships. So, for example, when President Chen did his transit visits to the U.S., his effort to elevate those transits into something more than purely unofficial transit visits, as understood by the U.S., actually created more tension with Washington, not less. A final debate that is worth mentioning, I think, is the debate over how to enter international organizations, in particular the United Nations. There's been a debate over Taiwan's desire to have some kind of participation in the UN since the early 1990s. And we go back and forth between the arguments for stressing substantive participation. So, the most important thing is to be there at the meeting. Less important to use a particular name or label for our participation, and those who say, nope, national dignity, national sovereignty is most important. So we must constantly be striving to increase the standing of Taiwan in international organizations. It's really hard to say from the standpoint of domestic politics what people think about that debate, because the debate itself, the very existence of a conversation about how and under what designation Taiwan and whether Taiwan should seek participation in international organizations has been politicized and sort of drawn into the vortex of partisan politics, so that, you know, we could say, well, we have the best possible measure of Taiwanese popular enthusiasm for UN participation, a national referendum on the issue. And we see that only about 35% of Taiwanese support entering the United Nations based on the results of the March 2008 referendum. Obviously, that's the wrong answer. You know, the referendum does not tell us how popular entering the United Nations is, because the referendum became a topic of partisan political combat, not substantive meaning for the voters. I think polls that are separated in time from those specific manifestations like the UN referendums suggest that, in fact, entering international organizations is extremely popular among Taiwanese people, but they don't know how to achieve it. And that's understandable, because no one knows how to achieve it, or it would have been accomplished by now. So, to respond to all of these dilemmas and debates and foreign policy goals and interests, Taiwan's presidents have laid out a series of foreign policy strategies. And the evolution of these strategies has something to do with the changes from one administration to another, but it also has a great deal to do with the steady increase in China's international and also military power, and the steady growth in the asymmetry of power between Taiwan and China. So they're not, you know, the evolution of Taiwan's foreign policy thinking is certainly not sui generis. It is in response to changes in the mainland. In the pre-Li Denghui, or the Jiang era, the original foreign policy posture of Jiang Jieshi and Jiang Jingguo was to assert the Republic of China as China, and to take a kind of rigid one China position that really hurt Taiwan in the long run, because when other international actors abandoned that position, Taiwan was left without a fallback. So in 1971, you know, Taiwan may have had the opportunity to negotiate its continued participation in the United Nations, but by sticking fiercely to this one China, the ROC is China position, Taiwan lost that opportunity and ended up withdrawing from the UN. I think under Jiang Jingguo, in the later years of Jiang Jingguo, the marginalization of Taiwan under this kind of policy was so evident that we see the beginnings of a new approach which comes to fruition under Li Denghui. So let me talk about Li Denghui briefly. Li Denghui's foreign policy, everyone knows, was 务实外交, pragmatic diplomacy, aggressively seeking opportunities to press Taiwan's case, to compete with China, and to affirm relations with other states on the basis of Taiwan as a good global citizen. And so the claim that Li Denghui used to advance 务实外交 was that Taiwan is democratic, Taiwan is successful, Taiwan is generous with its friends, and on this ground attempted to accumulate a larger kind of stable of friends and even diplomatic partners. This was easier to do in the 1990s than it is in the 2000s, because in the 1990s, the sort of foil to Li Denghui's good citizen Taiwan was a post-Tiananmen China, which had a much eroded international diplomatic position. I think Chen Shui-bian followed up on pragmatic diplomacy by sort of giving us pragmatic diplomacy with a side order of envelope pushing. Right? The emphasis shifted from Taiwan as good global citizen to Taiwan as good global citizen deserving of support. And in fact, sometimes it even felt like Taiwan had a kind of sense of entitlement, or you owe us, the world owes us its support. instead of basing its foreign policy on being democratic, successful, and generous with friends, we have a little bit more of a feeling of, yes, democratic, but also victimized and worthy of recognition as a nation. The Taiwanese foreign policy tried to make the claim internationally that you should take care of us because we are a nation, and nation states are respected and acknowledged in the modern international community, and therefore, you owe us this. And I think what was happening in the Chen administration was more of an appeal to an international sense of justice than to international self-interest. Whereas Lee Teng-hui was saying it's in your interest to support Taiwan, the Chen administration was more inclined to say it's in our interest for you to support Taiwan, so you should do it. Not to be too harsh, but sometimes, talking to policymakers in Washington during the Chen Shui-bian administration, sometimes I felt that they got a little bit of a vibe from Taiwan that you're reversing the old JFK formula to say, ask not what we can do for the world, ask what the world can do for us. And to be fair, part of the reason for that transformation was China's refusal to give Taiwan any concessions during the Chen administration, and left Taiwan, again, with even fewer good options for reaching out to the world. So that brings us to our final president, and to my final point. What about Ma Ying-jeou? I think Ma Ying-jeou's strategy represents a real shift from 务实外交 to something new. And I'm not sure if it's 现实外交 or 维新外交. I'm not sure if it's realistic diplomacy or idealistic diplomacy. And this, I think, is exactly the same question you're asking, because what makes the difference, is it realistic or idealistic, is how Beijing responds to this new foreign policy. It's realistic, 现实外交, in the sense that it recognizes China's growing influence and Taiwan's diminishing room for maneuver. I think Ma Ying-jeou understands that he understands the constraints and obstacles Taiwan is facing very well. It's a foreign policy strategy based on cross-strait stability and tolerance, and so sort of makes the claim, you should support us, the international community should support Taiwan because we're democratic and deserving, yes, but also because we're not going to cause any trouble for you. And we will be good. And we will help the world accomplish other goals by ensuring that there's no trouble in our region. In the area, in the things that we can control, we will control them in a way that serves the interest of international peace and stability. At the same time, though, I wonder if this is, in fact, 维新外交, idealistic foreign diplomacy, because to a significant extent, Ma's foreign policy seems to go through Beijing. He's resting his foreign policy on the assumption or expectation that Beijing will respond in a particular way. For example, this week, President Ma raised some eyebrows by saying there's not going to be any war during my presidency, and that's great. I'm so for that. I love the idea of no war during Ma's presidency, but I have to say, what's a defense planner supposed to make of that statement? What kind of message is that to Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, and also to the Pentagon, and also to people in Washington who have been encouraging the Bush administration to be more forthcoming with arms sales to Taiwan? I'm not really sure what we're supposed to do with that. Likewise, the diplomatic truce. This is a fundamental kind of foundational building block of President Ma's foreign policy, but it depends upon Beijing's cooperation, and it is a sort of non-falsifiable proposition, since we will never really know whether Beijing, whether the list of diplomatic partners for Taiwan hasn't changed because Beijing is observing a diplomatic truce, or because those diplomatic partners have decided not to make a change. We read that Paraguay wanted to make a change and didn't because Beijing discouraged it, but how do we know? How can we prove that it's working? So I would say, in conclusion, the big question going forward is this a realistic or an idealistic foreign policy or diplomacy? Is there a way that positive reinforcement can secure good behavior from Beijing? Given Taiwan's lack of options, this may be the only possible policy, right? Taiwan doesn't have a lot of sticks, so carrots is probably what we're left with. But whether it will work remains to be seen. Dr. Lin offers good reasons for optimism, but I think we won't see the caution or the cautious distrust of Beijing in many circles in Washington or in Taipei diminishing anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you for my colleagues who present two excellent papers here. Now I'm going to turn to our two distinguished colleagues who will comment on that. Dr. John Mearsheimer is going to comment on Dr. Lin's paper. John, please.
Is it okay if I stand up?
Sure, please.
Hope you can set the tone.
I enjoyed Professor Lin's presentation very much. I regretted that he didn't get to show all his slides, and I also regretted that he went through the slides so quickly. I understand he had no choice, but I found it to be very informative, and I thought his analysis was excellent. And I don't have a lot of disagreements with him. However, I would say that I did not find what he said to be very surprising. I drew two lessons from his talk, and I'd like to tell you what I think those lessons were. And then I'd like to conclude by making a few speculations of my own about the future. First lesson that I took from his talk was that both China and Taiwan have adopted more sophisticated foreign policies or more sophisticated grand strategies for dealing with each other and for dealing with the world around him. To start with the Chinese, he said that they now have employed an approach that might be described as a soft offensive or sophisticated softening, a sweeter carrot and a harder stick. It all reminded me of Teddy Roosevelt, who used to talk about speaking softly and carrying a big stick. When he got into the details, he emphasized that the order of the day in China is confident patience, and to build powerful military forces, but at the same time not to emphasize that you were going to use those military forces against any of your neighbors, and to concentrate on integrating China into the world economy, all for the purposes of growing the Chinese economy. And he also talked about the importance of an indirect approach, not directly confronting adversaries, but challenging them indirectly. Professor Rigger, in her presentation, used the phrase, a good global citizen. I think it's fair to say that what China is trying to do is indicate to the rest of the world and to its neighbors in Asia, especially Taiwan, that it is a good global citizen. And this is clearly a smart policy for China. China at this point in time should be concentrating on growing itself economically. One, it's just very important to have lots of wealth for purposes of the prosperity of your people. But secondly, for purposes of building military forces and throwing your weight around in Asia and getting what you want, you have to be very rich. There's just no getting around that. And you can't build a powerful military and use it for coercive purposes until you're very rich. And China is not very rich at this point in time. It's heading in that direction, but it's not there yet. And it makes eminently good sense not to pick a fight with the United States or anyone else at this point in time. Just think about Taiwan. It would not be in China's interest at all to threaten to use military force against Taiwan, because in a war over Taiwan, China would lose to the United States. It's not in a position to challenge America. America is a far more powerful, has a far more powerful military at this point in time. China would be much smarter to bide its time and wait till it has a much more powerful military relative to everyone else in the region. One point that Professor Lin did not make that I think he should emphasize when talking about China's situation today is that China is greatly aided by the fact that the United States is stuck in two losing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States is in no position to cause any trouble in Asia simply because it is bogged down in the Middle East. And there is no evidence that the United States is going to get out of the Middle East anytime soon. Given that situation, the United States will go to great lengths to prevent crises from breaking out in Asia. And it will go to great lengths to make sure that the Taiwanese don't provoke the Chinese into starting a war over Taiwanese independence. He put up a chart that listed U.S. warnings to Taipei from December 9th, 2003 to February 26th, 2008. As soon as I saw that chart, the first thing that popped into my mind was the fact that the United States invaded Iraq on March 19th, 2003. The UN headquarters was blown up in August 2003, and therefore it's hardly surprising that his chart starts on December 9th, 2003, with the Americans telling the Taiwanese to behave themselves because they don't want a crisis in Asia. And of course, nothing has happened between that date and February 26, 2008, which was the last date on your chart. All of this gets to the subject of Taiwanese policy today. What the Taiwanese are finally recognizing, and they were quite slow to understand this, is that they can't have a confrontational policy with China because the United States will not allow them to have a confrontational policy with China. And the United States indeed will get very rough with Taiwan if Taiwan thinks it's going to cause trouble in Asia for the United States, because the United States is in serious trouble in the Middle East and serious trouble more generally around the world. And the last thing it needs is trouble between Taiwan and China. So the bottom line here is that both the Chinese and the Taiwanese have developed rather sophisticated strategies for dealing with each other and the broader region, and this is all for the good. And I think Professor Lin makes that very clear. Second point that I took away from his presentation is that not much has really changed. There's no question that the rhetoric is nicer. And we Americans, as you know, love fancy rhetoric. As most of you know, the Americans talk one way and act another way, right? So hearing people talk to each other in very very nice ways is somewhat soothing to American ears. But if you're really sophisticated, what you want to ask yourself is, what's going on below the surface? And it seems to me not much. I think it's, and I'll spell out the details here based on his talk, but I think it's captured in a headline that was on one of your slides when Hu Jintao visited Japan recently. The headline said, according to your slide, "Atmosphere is good, nothing is resolved." Atmosphere is good, nothing is resolved. It seems to me in a very important way that captures what is going on in terms of the relationship between China and Taiwan. I was struck by the slide that you put up of attitudes in Taiwan on independence versus the status quo versus reintegrating Taiwan into a greater China. What I think the slide shows is how little change there really has been over time. I mean, there were certainly some ups and downs, but they were not major ups and downs. There were no big swings in public opinion in Taiwan. It seemed to me that about a quarter of the people, roughly, were in favor of independence over time, and about half the people are in favor of the status quo, and about 15%, that's 15%, are in favor of putting Taiwan and China together. Well, if those numbers are correct, that means that roughly 3 out of every 4 Taiwanese wants no part of China. They want either de facto or de jure independence. And if that's the case, we're in for some rough times ahead. With regard to the Chinese, almost everybody knows, but I'll just say it, they have no interest in maintaining the status quo over the long term. They may be willing to live with the status quo for now, but the Chinese are obviously interested in bringing Taiwan back into the fold. Now, how you square that circle, I don't think anyone knows. So I think if you sort of look at the future, this situation does not look very good. Now, speaking of the future, I want to make 3 points, and then I'll sit down. First of all, as you know, or as most of you know, I believe that if China continues to rise, it will become more assertive in Asia, especially with regard to Taiwan. I don't think this is because the Chinese are evil or anything like that. I think it's because great powers, as they become increasingly powerful, tend to throw their weight around. All of you have watched the United States run around the world since the Cold War ended, using military force here, there, and everywhere. This is not because the American people are evil. It's because great powers tend to throw their weight around. And given that China wants Taiwan back, and I don't think any of us have any doubt about that, if they become very powerful, much more powerful in terms of the global balance of power, and certainly in terms of the Asian balance of power than they are today, they're going to use that military might to try to get their way. And of course, the United States is going to stand in their way because the United States does not want China to become especially powerful in Asia. You remember the Bush administration, when it first came into office, had its gun sights on China. And if it hadn't been for September 11th, the United States would have focused on China, and it would not have been a pretty picture. The reason the United States and China have had very good relations is because what happened on September 11th. And by the way, one of the reasons the United States got caught with its pants down on September 11th was because American leaders in the Bush administration refused to believe that terrorism was a serious problem. They thought the main problem that we faced was China. And now, of course, they're stuck in these two wars, and God knows they may be there forever, the way things are going, which is wonderful news for China. But my main point to you is you do not want to underestimate how deeply committed the United States will be to blocking China's rise. And again, you don't want to underestimate how willing China will be to use its military force to get its way in Asia, especially with regard to Taiwan. All of this means that the United States will harden its commitment to Taiwan over time, assuming that China continues to rise. And I think for anybody who's studied the Cold War and is trying to project ahead as to what the competition between the United States and China's neighbors with China will look like, you can't help but being struck by the fact that Taiwan is a very dangerous flashpoint, unlike anything that we had during the Cold War. That's point number one. Point number two is a lot of people buy the logic of that argument, which I just laid out, but they say there are other factors that will trump it. And many of the more optimistic types focus on democracy and make the argument that Taiwan is a democracy, and as China democratizes, and if it eventually becomes a vibrant democracy, then there's good reason to think that Taiwan and China will be brought together under the same democratic system. I think this is a foolish argument. Just because Taiwan is a democracy and China is a democracy does not mean that they're going to want to live together. The United States is a democracy and Canada is a democracy, and the Canadians have no interest in becoming Americans. This is really a question all about national identity. It's not the political system that Taiwan has or China has. It's all about national identity. And it's all about, when you get right down to it, how the Taiwanese think about themselves. Do they think of themselves as Taiwanese, or do they think of themselves as Chinese? Now, the prevailing wisdom among a lot of people is that as we have greater economic interdependence, and just greater interdependence in general, more contact among peoples, more contact between the Taiwanese and the Chinese, that contact, those interactions will break down the powerful national identities that have formed. I think that's a fundamental misreading of history. And I actually think that the more interaction you have between Taiwanese and Chinese, the more hardening you'll see of Taiwanese identity and even Chinese identity. I believe that there is substantial evidence that Taiwanese businessmen who spend a lot of time in China develop a more powerful sense of their national identity than those who remain in Taiwan itself. So I don't think this problem is going to go away because of more intercourse, economic and otherwise, between Taiwanese and Chinese peoples. My third point is that we are now at the start of an economic meltdown, global economic meltdown, for which we have no real understanding. It is really quite stunning how completely the economics profession and the business community has failed to anticipate this crisis, to understand exactly what's going on and where it is all headed. They simply don't know. We may have another Great Depression. I am not saying we will have another Great Depression. I am saying we might have one. And there is no economist who at this point feels confident enough to say that can't happen for reasons X, Y, and Z. They are flying blind. Everybody agrees, however, that there is potential for disaster here. And you want to understand that the full weight of this meltdown has not hit yet. Here in the United States, people like to say that the real economy has not been affected yet, but it is coming. It's going to get much worse before it gets better in the United States. Problem is, we don't know how bad it's going to get. It is possible that this economic meltdown could have catastrophic consequences. I hope that is not the case. I really hope that's not the case, as I'm sure everybody in this room does. But we do not understand where this is headed. And the point I would make to you is that if we have a situation that's somewhat analogous to what happened during the Great Depression, it is very hard to see where this all ends up. Right? And I'm talking here about China, Taiwan, and the United States. As you all know, the United States has been an interventionist power of the first order since 1989, when the Cold War ended, and certainly since 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. It is easy to hypothesize plausible scenarios where the United States, in the event of an economic meltdown, fundamentally alters its foreign policy and becomes much less interventionist around the world and begins to look to others to pull more of their own weight. Could be that the United States will rely much more on Japan and India and Russia to deal with China, simply because of economic consequences at home. Let's talk about the rise of China. The rise of China basically assumes that the global meltdown is not going to be very great and it's not going to affect China in any meaningful ways. Is this a safe assumption? Who knows? How is the global meltdown, assuming that we have one of major proportions, going to affect China relative to the United States? We don't know. It may be that China comes out of this relatively unscathed and the United States is hurt very badly. Or it might be the reverse. Who knows? I could go on and on. What about nationalism? What about fascism? You know, the rise of Hitler in 1933 is largely traced to the consequences of the Great Depression and all of the economic problems in Germany between their defeat in 1918 and his coming to power on January 30th, 1933. If we have a really serious meltdown in the global economy, what's this going to do at home in the United States and at home in China? We don't know. What I'm saying here is that you want to keep an open mind on what the future has in store for all of us, because it may be that we are at what I like to call a plastic moment in history. This may be a plastic moment in history. Professor Lin's comments, my comments on his excellent presentation are all predicated on the assumption that the basic structure of the system is going to remain intact in the future. And I actually hope very much that that's true. But I'm not certain that's the case. I'm not certain that's the case. I think it may be that, to use Alan Greenspan's words, that we're going to be hit by a tsunami, right? And this is going to have untold consequences. Just one final point on this, and then I'll quit. I went to a discussion the other evening about the consequences of the election for foreign policy, the economy, and domestic American politics. And Professor Sam Peltzman, who teaches in the business school here, talked about the economy. And his opening point, which I thought was very wise, was that he said, take everything that John McCain and Barack Obama have said about what they're going to do regarding the economy once they're in office and just flush it down the toilet. Forget it. Don't pay any attention to it, because the situation is so dire, right, and changing so rapidly that the proposals that they're laying out now are going to be moot by the time one of them takes office in January of next year. I think that's true. And I've reflected on that comment because he, in effect, was saying that maybe people like me should think in similar ways about foreign policy. And I'm not saying that will be the case, but I'm just saying we want to keep an open mind. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and appreciate your comments and word of wisdom. Although we don't know what will happen, this economic tsunami on us, but one thing I can say is that it does raise the national pride of the Chinese government, because a couple of weeks ago I had a visit to the foreign ministry of China, and they had conversation with the vice minister of foreign ministry of China, and the first thing that they talked about was that 不是打电话给胡锦涛，昨天打电话给胡锦涛。He said that George W. Bush called Hu Jintao yesterday. So basically, what he meant is that he spoke with such a pride that even the superpower like the United States call us for help. That's the implication that I got. So I think that one thing that has an impact on China is that their national pride. That's it. Now, let's turn to the second discussant, Professor T.J. Chen.
Can I use the podium?
Please.
I enjoy the subtle debate between Professor Lin and Professor Mearsheimer. And I would like to comment on that a little bit before I turn to Shelley's paper. I think basically Professor Lin argues that China is rising. China has become more sophisticated. China has become richer and richer. And China indeed is managing the region very well, and probably across the region as well. While Professor Mearsheimer reminds us that, there's lots of uncertainties there. Anything can happen. It's dangerous to rely on the secular linear projection, which is very easy to make, but very difficult to sustain or to demonstrate. Yeah. And as I prepare for this conference, I looked into the economic dimension more carefully. Perhaps then my colleagues here for the final panel of this session of this conference, I saw evidence on both sides, really. And just to use the final points that Professor John Mearsheimer presented here as as a focus. A lot of science shows that China is probably less immune to the financial meltdown than other countries in the world. I'm talking about the biggest, for example, than Japan, and certainly less so than United States and United Kingdom. In China, I suppose that many people argue that this is basically Anglo-Saxon problems, and not even continental European problems. And Japan is probably kind of arm and out there because it's an intimate relationship with the United States in terms of trade ties and investment ties. Yeah. So you do have that kind of the evidence showing that China has less investment in the financial markets here, despite its large holding of the T-bills, but it's relatively immune to the financial meltdown here. Many people there also identify some other aspects where we tend to overlook because it's below the radar screen. The growing domestic demand in China, the emerging markets in Africa and some part of Southeast Asia where the China has been doing a lot of investment in the past decades also. They argue that we tend to overlook, indeed, 6% growth rate for Africa for the past few years. And China has been doing a lot there. So, indeed, China can have a lot of cushions, more so than the United States and more so than Japan in weathering through this crisis and so on. So that's sort of the a point to sort of the chip in for the Zhong Bin's thesis. But then if we turn around and sort of look at the John Mearsheimer's thesis, we also find a lot of evidence there. We cannot foresee, indeed, so many great events that in the 20th century and that have affected us grossly. No one, indeed, in the econ department have foreseen way back in 1973, the first oil crisis. No one. No one has made that sort of prediction. No political scientists, I should say, have seen the advance of the 1989 Eastern European revolutions either. Political scientists have equally dismal records in making predictions. Just to give you an example, Brzezinski had been arguing that before the 1989 revolution in Europe, saying that it was impossible for the Eastern European and Central European countries to turn democratic, to do away with the communism and socialism. But right after the 1989, he immediately changed an adverb from the impossible to inevitable. He says, well, given the sort of the flaws or design of the system, it was inevitable. It's just a matter of time that we did away, the people there did away with the communism and so on. And that shows that it's very, very difficult to foresee any great events or bad events. And I think it is also very difficult to project and to predict any sort of the major moves that China may be taking once China has made it. One of the very interesting questions that most of Japanese has been asking these days is not whether they would like to buy the China's lines on foreign policies today, which is peaceful right. They just turn it around and say, will there be peace after the rise? Of course, it is utterly insane for China to say that there will be some sort of conflict. We need to throw our weight around if we reach that sort of thing. Of course, you need to sort of play the great themes of peaceful rights. But then the questions for others, particularly for those countries directly affected by the China, i.e. Japan, perhaps South Korea and Taiwan and so on, then they turn around this stand that questions on its head. Will there be peace after the rise or not? So you see a lot of anxiety in Japan, of course. But the point I'm trying to take home here is that you do have secular trend there showing that China has become more reasonable, responsible, sophisticated, and so on. But there are lots of uncertainties. Just one question I just cannot answer. I like the Professor Mearsheimer to answer this question. A lot of China specialists, for example, today look at China's rise here and there in various domains, economic domains, political domains, and so on, and saying that China probably is not really that bad. I mean, China simply tried to ensure that it will be secured. It would eventually take Taiwan back. Taiwan would not be in the hands of the United States forever. China's parameters would be safe. China's oil supplies would continue to flow. China's navies in the East China Seas and Malacca Straits and Indian Oceans will be protected. China is simply insecure. It's trying to be secure only. But then if you talk to the DOD folks, the State Department, and certainly the CIA, but not China specialists of international relations theories, China is not just insecure. China may be insecure, but China may also be ambitious. China would like to be on a par with great powers, would like to be indeed a first among equal, if possible, and so on. So we just don't know, what China is up to. What China is up to, how China is going to spend its $1.8 trillion foreign exchange reserve. What is the goal? Is there a goal? Is there a strategy or not? Or is China's foreign policy simply an output of bureaucratic fight indoors? Is there a grand strategy or not? Or is China moving one step to another and in a very improvised way? We just don't know that much, I think. there is no consensus in the field. At least I don't see any sort of the fruitful exchange between China specialists on the one hand who argue that China is simply insecure, and the IR theorists who argues that China is ambitious. That's point number one. Point number two, let me now turn to Shelley's the papers. Essentially, Shelley's papers is a realist papers, it seems to me. Despite that at the end, she raised the questions whether Ma Ying-jeou is idealistic or realist. But I think the tenors of her papers that she sent to me, and also her presentation, is that Taiwan, whoever is in power, has to be realistic to survive, to safeguard its de facto independence or status. Taiwan is small, China is big, you have asymmetrical powers there. The world is a very cruel, very nasty place. We would learn this from the Thucydides' descriptions of the wars between Sparta and Athens some 2,000 years ago, right? In that most famous Armenian dialogue. The strong, the great powers, can do what they want, and the weak, including Taiwan, suffers as it must. That's just reality. There is not much sort of room for maneuver, Shelley sort of argue. And therefore, given that range of sort of the possibilities is very narrow, not much room for maneuver, you probably need to be innovative. You probably need to somehow steer the middle of the course between the extremes. And it is precisely, she argued, what Taiwan has been doing for the past 20 years, something after democratization. From Li Denghui through Chen Shui-bian to Ma Ying-jeou. You have to abide by sort of guiding principles there. And therefore, you cannot indeed take sort of extremes of the sort of stance. If you do so, you have to regret. You have to come back. And I sort of would like to. I tend to agree with her. Really, sort of characterization of Taiwan's foreign and the policy. After all, I sat in the Ken Walls' class during my graduate student days, and after all, on this panel, we have a doyen, we have a dean of realists here from University of Chicago. But I think in addition to realism, there are also two other kind of intellectual perspectives we can probably borrow to shed some light on the Taiwan's foreign policies. It seems to me that if you argue that Taiwan has to accommodate to survive, to safeguard what it has already possessed, well, that doesn't probably jive perfectly well with say, second half of Li Denghui's tenures and the full tenures of the Chen Shui-bian's foreign policy, which I believe probably can be better sort of analyzed from the perspective of liberalism rather than realism. Liberalism argues that, ideas matters, not just interest. And if we have this idea, democracy, prosperity, that sort of thing, we probably should be able to collect, sympathy. And we should be able to find more friends. And therefore, we probably can, go a long way in the solidifying, if not enhancing, our sort of the international status. Which is why the Chen Shui-bian, it's often perceived as very venturesome, very assertive, that sort of thing. I think it's not necessarily just he was too venturesome. I think it is also because he and his colleagues believe that international politics is not just 100% realism. It's 50% realism, 50% idealism, 50% the liberalism. And if you draw the line well, you will collect friends, and so on. Ma Ying-jeou, it seems to me, actually is more realistic than idealistic. Realizing that provocations, quote unquote, or attempts to do a lot, to improve your status, will bring you no results. The experiments during the Chen Shui-bian era has failed, and therefore we need to come back, to indeed compromise with the reality. And I believe that is the starting point of his foreign policy. Okay, so I think probably we can use another sort of intellectual sort of perspective to shed light, on the very same reality that Shelley has sort of presented. One final sort of small point: Constructivism probably is also helpful in analyzing Taiwan's foreign policy. Constructivism, which is one of the three intellectual thoughts in the IR, basically argues that how you identify yourself, how you define the situation, will determine how you identify and determine your national interest. Now, if you look at how the DPP or Penguin folks and Pen Blue folks have been describing or depicting, characterizing cross-strait relationships, you probably will not be surprised why one is so assertive and the others are more kind of accommodating. I think for DPP guys, China is just a neighbor. For the Pen Blue guys, I think China is a brother. And then you have brotherhood versus neighborhood things. And if you have two different sort of identities, you identify your sort of target nation differently, therefore you will act accordingly, I think. And therefore you will have drastic departures, differences in terms of your foreign policy behavior. I'll just stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Before we open up to the floor, Professor Lin asked for 3 minutes to make a comment.
I just want to say Professor Mearsheimer is not only a great scholar, he's also a mind reader. He didn't see the slide, but he already read a line from the slide. I said, the idea is reminiscent of Teddy Roosevelt's adage, hold a big stick and speak softly. So my respect to Professor Mearsheimer again. Many excellent points he raised. I thank him for that. One particular I'd like to explore a little bit further. He said there's no real change, what I said. I would, if I may, I would differ from that. If there were no real change, then all the slides that show that the prevailing views were different from mine would not be true. The prevailing views have been trumped and overtaken by real events. But I said before they took place. We can argue and argue, but these days, as I'm getting, well, I don't know whether I should say this, I'm getting old, I value more on being accurate on prediction rather than on theoretical exploration. Let me say this. China was very assertive concerning Taiwan on the surface, but now on the surface you don't read assertive. You don't detect assertiveness. Of course, inside it's still there. Let me just show a few slides to show how they're changing their thinking. For instance, you read this from People's Liberation Army Daily. Military hard power and military soft power are inseparable. The two closely follow each other like the shadow and the body. They have a mutually enhancing relationship. And also now the PLA is stressing to win the war before fighting. They took it from Sun Tzu. Again, learned from the Iraq situation. They also stressed on the idea of a holistic victory as defined by the former commander of 38th Army, Group Army. Holistic victory means minimizing casualties on both sides. Therefore, when it is applied to Taiwan, it means a war of paralysis rather than a war of annihilation. It also, PLA has expanded the original say by Sun Tzu, the win a war without fighting, into the win a war with prudence before fighting, the win a war with minimum fighting, the win a war with infrequent fighting, and in win a war with smart fighting. I'll stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And gentlemen, the way I see it is that the China's policy towards Taiwan, the different period of time has different weight, different degree of weight in there. Because China's policy towards Taiwan probably can summarize in four main items: propaganda, continue to emphasize one China principle as a bottom line, as a red line. And second thing is diplomatic isolation. The third one is military coercion. And the fourth one is economic integration. And at different points of time, there's different weight being put in there. And for this panel, we focus on international affairs, international relations, and as my colleagues just point out, right now is to see to what extent the Beijing leader would respond to Ma Ying-jeou's détente approach. Now, I would like to invite my colleagues to come to the podium. Can I turn off that? Could you turn off that? Yeah. Now, I would like to invite my colleagues to the podium so that we can respond. You sit here? Okay. Now open to the floor. Please, sir.
I want to ask Dr. Ling, one thing recently I also went to Taiwan. I think what seems to me that this change from Chen Shui-bian to Ma Ying-jeou is not a kind of personal, or it is probably the end of an era. It is a kind of very important change. So therefore, I also appreciate what John Neshama has said. The situation is not, I should not take a fixed view, but I also argue with John, who said that more connection with mainland China would make the Taiwan national identity harden. John, is that you're saying? Anyway, now what I want to point out is that Ma Ying-jeou's rise as a non-Taiwanese. He was born outside Taiwan. His father was from Hunan province, which would not have been possible if the Taiwanese with majority wanting to become independent, if Chen Shui-bian was successful. So this is very significant that a non-Taiwanese who had been elected as Taiwan president. And another thing is what has been missing from your talk is Ma Ying-jeou has recently said in America that the relations between the mainland and Taiwan was special relations. Was not easy. So I think this has caused a lot of controversy. So now what I was thinking, because you are an expert, I want to put it before you whether you think my hunch is correct. I think Ma Ying-jeou represents a kind of shifting from the Taiwan kind of nationalism to a kind of Chineseness. Okay, now what I say, the Chineseness is not either or. It's not either unification, Tong, or independence, or Du. It is a kind of, he's preparing towards a kind of integration of the two sides, how to face in the future, as John Neshama has said. So that would be a very kind of important significance, also considering that now the crumbling down of the Minjitang, the PPP and the Taiwan independence movement. So what do you think? I think Ma Ying-jeou has looked like he was criticizing this and that. But I learned from a friend who was a colleague of Ma Ying-jeou, who is now supposed to be a kind of a think tank of Ma Ying-jeou. I will not name him. He said, Ma Ying-jeou is trying to do it gradually, because Ma Ying-jeou is having a difficult position. Actually, Caesar's wife. The Caesar's wife should be above suspicion. So he was trying to, to do it gradually, but his aim is to demolish the Taiwan independence movement and gradually moving towards integration. I want to know the.
我们先问一下，先看一下他们这个还没有。Do we have other questions, please? Please.
Jerry, you just mentioned that President Lee Teng-hui had a pragmatic foreign policy, but actually his pragmatic foreign policy turned out to be a productive policy when he proposed his special state-to-state relationship in 1999. And you say Chen Shui-bian's foreign policy is also a flexible policy or something like that. But actually, his lighting fire diplomacy turned out to be what former Deputy Secretary Robert Zelig said, hitting wall diplomacy. So, and we don't know whether Ma Ying-jeou's diplomatic truths will succeed in the future or not. But at least I think his combination of idealism and realism, because China is not that rich as Dr. Meir Shammer said. China is not that rich, but it has sufficient economic resources at hand. It has more political influence in the international organizations, and it has international influence everywhere. So we cannot compete with China. So when Ma Ying-jeou was elected in March, he was facing a very strong China. So nothing he can do, and China has a series of good cards, and in Ma Ying-jeou's hands, he doesn't have any good card. So the only thing he can do is to show his goodwill, to show his to lower his hostility, Taiwan's hostility to China. I think probably he should develop some give and take of his own in exchange of China's positive move with goodwill. But so far, it is very difficult for Taiwan to stand alone. For example, if you want to join the WHA, to participate in WHA or WHO, even the United States cannot help us too much. You have to get China's nod. So before we can become part of the WHO or WHO. So I think probably maybe we know China's sticker is less visible right now, and its color is much sweeter than ever before. But we have to swallow that because nothing we can do. We have no choice at all. So can you think of any better way than what Ma Ying-jeou is doing? I think Taiwan will appreciate. Thank you.
I will solicit the comment and the questions before ask the panelists to answer. 1, 2, and 3, please.
My name is Thomas Huang. I come in just hear the Professor Ricker's comments. One of them, if I quote or misunderstand what you say, please correct me. You say Taiwan is asking the world help me. You quoted Kennedy's saying, don't ask Taiwan. Don't ask Taiwan what to do, but instead Taiwan ask the world to help Taiwan. Is that correct? That's what you say. I thought I have a different point of view. I think it's wrong quoting. The reason is that Taiwan is it's really weaker side, small potato. The base is leave Taiwan alone, and Taiwan try to help international. Taiwan try to join international, even try to join UN and then WHO and everything. So that means Taiwan no one join. The problem is in China, complete block. So brain on the wrong schedule. Second is you are talking about Taiwan has no option Is that, do I call it here right? But I thought the time, yes, in the weaker side, but only thing Taiwan has is democracy. As the truth of matter, I think Taiwan's democracy, since the Ma Ying-jeou come into power, I think it's weakening. It's major setback in the democracy. And for one example, in September 26th, at the IFJ, the International Forum of Journalists, published a statement, two parties. But democracy needs to be, like I say, the freedom of media. And warning Taiwan's administration says Ministry of Information is influenced CNA is a central news agency about say should author do not publish too much issue on the formulas of statements, and also requesting of the statement of the diminishing or eliminating of the statement criticizing Ma Ying-jeou. So all this is the drawback. So that's the thing I am really more concerned. I think Taiwan should emphasize more on the democracy footstand. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, I got only two more questions, 1 and 2, and then we will ask to comment, to respond.
I have a question for Professor Regan, a very simple question, maybe it's a stupid question. In addition to TVBS, do you watch other medias? Because TVBS is not a popular media and have a strong bias. Sometimes we would say it's like a very strong bias. I don't know, do you get any information from other media?
Of course I do.
Okay.
TVBS is a good example simply because, there's a list of 300 polls and none of them deal with foreign policy. So it was a way to start my talk. But of course, I don't only limit myself to TVBS as an information source about Taiwan.
Thank you.
Please.
Okay, thank you so much for the very interesting and excellent talk. I'm Win Chiu. I used to be the professor at UIC for some 30-some years. I recently visited People's Republic of China 3 times and talking to some of the high-ranking officials, so quite extensively. My feeling is this one. There has been a long way regarding the Taiwan-China relationship in the last half a century. Starting 60 years ago, they are fighting each other like real enemy. Now they are starting to talking. So there's a coming, starting a dialogue. So there's a big change in the relationship between two parties. I feel a major change in recent years is expressed by Hu Jintao regarding 9·2共识. It's the 9·2 consensus. I don't know how to translate it into English. You understand? 9·2共识.
92 consensus is how you translate it.
So that's a very important consensus by Chinese leadership. Chinese, the 9·2共识 means you recognize there's one China. And what is this China? What's the name? What does it mean, this one China? From Taiwan point of view, you can say you're the Republic of China. From the Communist China point of view, they say they are People's Republic of China. So they say you can express your view. You can disagree with what you say, but you can express your view, just one China. As long as you recognize one China, you can. What is this China? You can express 中华民国人民共和国. That's okay. But under this assumption, if you agree with this, anything else we can talk. You can sit down equally, as an equal party. Then, in the future, if there's a reunification in the future, there's no timetable. If there's a reunification in the future, what will be the name of the future China, unified China. They say it's up to everybody. It's not going to be 中华人民共和国. It may not be. It may be 中华民国. It may be New China. This is the way they express it to us, to me. So I feel this is a great consensus, and it's a reason. The reason I say it's reasonable to accept one China policy is, after all, the people in Taiwan, the name of the nation is called Republic of China. That's China. So the one China. So right now, actually, before the China is Taiwan's Republic of China. Now, after a certain time, 20, 30 years ago, then everybody recognized the other party. So right now, in terms of name, it's still China, China. So one China policy, I feel is reasonable. As I'm Taiwanese too, I feel that's reasonable. But the reason why the Taiwanese are so much against mainland China, especially unification right now, is because the political system is different. The social value is different. The political system, the justice value, everything is many of those values are different. If you have a difference in value, how can you get together? How can you force two people with a different ideology, different value together? Just impossible. So I told those party officials, that's including, for example, vice chairman of the 国台办副主任. I say, if you are a family, husband and wife, you have to live together, marry together, you must respect each other. You must have the consensus, respect each other, otherwise you're going to get together. So right now, Taiwan and China, if they like to move together, you must respect each other. China must earn the heart of Taiwanese people. Otherwise they could not. And right now, their policy is just like this one. They told us, they said, the policy right now in China is not war. It's a peaceful development, peaceful relationship. Without this, if there's a war, they say, what they have earned in the last 20, 30 years, economically, again, they will be lost. They don't want to see that just for Taiwan. This question. So they would like to avoid every question to really avoid the war and move on. So that's my kind of feeling. So I did not see too much discussion about 九二共识 among the people in Taiwan. But I thought that's a very gigantic step. Actually, I mentioned to them. I said last year. I said you told us privately it's 九二共识, but you have not officially announced. But I was happy to see Hu Jintao this year announced about 九二共识.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask my distinguished colleagues to respond to those questions at 3 minutes each, please.
Interesting point of view raised. There are two kinds of public opinion surveys commissioned by Mainland Affairs Council. One concerns the identity issue. And in that, there has been tremendous change. As Professor Mearsheimer pointed out, when interactions increased between mainland and Taiwan, the identity issue would rise. Yes, he was absolutely right. So now the group who call themselves Taiwanese has taken supremacy, about 44-45%. The group who call themselves both Chinese and Taiwanese have been about 40-41%. The group who call themselves Chinese has dropped. In 1992, it was 48%. Now it's about 9, 6, 7, 5%. Tremendous change. However, the other survey concerning independence and unification, as I've shown, has shown a bedrock of stability. Professor Mearsheimer was absolutely right. There isn't too much change. So how to explain? I would say the first survey expresses the heart, the feelings. The second survey expresses the mind, the reason. Another point Professor Mearsheimer stated, which actually I feel very flattered, I'm very pleased to hear that. He said Taiwan has a grand strategy. I didn't say that. I didn't really say that. Taiwan does not. But however, under my administration, I think there has been tremendous progress. Thank you so much.
Shelley.
Okay. on the issue of realism in China or in Taiwan's foreign policy, I think the biggest reason for, I think that I sort of acknowledge the role of liberalism and even constructivism in thinking about how Taiwan tries to respond to China. But one of the great challenges for Taiwanese foreign policymakers is that I think the PRC foreign policymakers are true believers in realism with a capital R. And so their behavior is so dominated by that logic that when you're trying to, it's almost like they're playing in two different games. And so Taiwan doesn't have any realist cards, that's true. They have liberal cards, interdependence and so on, and they have constructivist cards, but they're playing in a realist game. And I think China owns the board and the tokens, so it's sort of a challenge. The only other thing that I wanted to mention is one quick point there on a realist card that Ma Ying-jeou may find himself ironically in control of is precisely the uptick in Taiwan independence sentiment under Ma Ying-jeou. Bob Sutter has been asking for months for the Taiwanese government to articulate a kind of plan B. If all this niceness doesn't work, then what? What's the threat that you hold if China doesn't respond to Taiwan's overtures? And I think a rising sense among Taiwanese that, okay, guess what? The Ma Ying-jeou model doesn't work. We need to stiffen up and start setting fires again. That looks like a card for Ma to play in that realist game. On the issue of identity, most of my most recent research is on youth attitudes and youth politics in Taiwan, and I really think the identity issue is just way more complicated than do we think of ourselves as Taiwanese, Chinese, both or neither suggests. Our thinking about cross-strait relations has for decades been predicated on the idea that pro-Taiwan and anti-China are two sides of the same coin. And I think if you look at the attitudes, if you probe deeply the attitudes of Taiwanese under 30, that equation falls apart, and they do not equate being Taiwanese, loving Taiwan, being pro-Taiwan with any particular attitude toward mainland China. And so you have people who vote for the DPP, think of themselves as Taiwanese, are strongly identified with Taiwan, who nonetheless are eager to embrace opportunities on the other side. No, it doesn't make them pro-unification, but over time, I think it changes the basis of understanding between the two sides. That the old paradigm of us versus them, and you have to choose one side or the other, is eroding as a consequence of the changing opportunities for young Taiwanese, including globalization, including interactions across the strait. And I just don't think that identity is fixed. I mean, it's changed radically over the last 20 years. There's no reason why it cannot change radically in some other direction, perhaps consistent with past trends, perhaps not consistent with past trends in the next 20 years. And just one final point on that as a kind of example of how these things interact. If you ask people, are you for independence if it can be achieved peacefully with no cost? And are you for unification if the two sides are the same in all significant ways? The modal category, the most frequent response is yes to both questions. Yes, I'm pro-independence. Yes, I'm pro-unification. So we can't keep on sort of focusing only on the black and white unification, independence. We have to open our categories to consider a broader range of options, at least on the Taiwan side. And then, again, it falls back into Beijing's lap. What will you allow?
Good, thank you very much.